Government Operations Committee to order, and we're meeting today to begin at least an overview of a study we wish to undertake on public-private partnerships. And we're very pleased today to welcome the CEO of P3 Canada, Mr. John McBride. And you're very welcome, Mr. McBride. Thank you for taking time to be with us today. And if you'd like to begin with a brief presentation, and then we'll open the floor to questions.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to appear today. It's my pleasure to be here on behalf of PPP Canada to speak about P3s and the Canadian P3 market. As members of Parliament, you're acutely aware that Canada faces a great need for infrastructure renewal. According to the Canadian Federation of Municipalities in 2007, they identified a potential infrastructure deficit for all levels of government at between $350 and $400 billion. As a consequence, governments across Canada are pursuing ways of getting the best results for their infrastructure dollars. Many have recognized the value of engaging private sector expertise and innovation through public-private partnerships, more commonly known as P3s. P3s are a means to inject greater accountability, whole life cycle cost optimization, and financial discipline into government's contractual relationships with the private sector. In Ontario, these types of deals are known as AFP, or Alternative Financing and Procurement. In the UK, they are known as PFI, or Private Finance Initiatives. But broadly speaking, P3s refer to an umbrella of concepts related to the role of the private sector in procuring public infrastructure. PPP Canada defines P3s as a long-term, performance-based approach for procuring public infrastructure, where the private sector assumes a major share of the responsibility in terms of risk and financing for the delivery and performance of the infrastructure, from design and structural planning right through to long-term maintenance. De façon plus concrète, cela signifie
In practical terms, this means the governments do not pay for the asset until it is built, and a substantial portion is paid over the life of the asset only if it is properly maintained and performs. The costs are known upfront and for the life cycle of the asset, meaning that taxpayers are not on the financial hook for cost overruns, delays, or any performance issues over the asset's life. For example, imagine that the company that built your house was also responsible for any repairs and maintenance over your 25-year mortgage. Given the amount that you will pay them every month once it is constructed is agreed to before the house is built, your payments do not go up if something breaks or needs replacing. Because of this, your builder would consider the most cost-efficient way of doing something, perhaps installing a metal roof rather than shingles. More expensive to install, but more durable and easier and cheaper to maintain. Furthermore, if your air conditioner breaks and it isn't repaired in the agreed-upon time frame, you can deduct from the amount of your next payment to them. To be clear, P3s are not privatization. Rather, they are a contractual relationship with the private sector for the designing, building, financing, and maintenance of public infrastructure. Ownership of the asset remains with the public sector.
The toolbox to deliver public infrastructure investments Canadians need. They're not always the right solution, but when applied to the right projects can provide many benefits, including greater value for money for taxpayers, on-budget and on-time delivery of public infrastructure, greater accountability and performance standards, greater consideration of the whole life cycle of a project, fiscal planning certainty, and they allow the government the ability to focus their efforts on what they do best, defining the services Canadians need instead of prescribing how they should be delivered. P3s do involve costs. The cost of private sector financing is higher, but the involvement of private sector finance is critical to achieving the benefits as it ensures risks are transferred and the disciplines and incentives to achieve better results exist. P3s also involve greater upfront planning and bid preparation costs, as the private sector must commit to a long-term undertaking and put their money at risk. However, P3s are the right solution when the benefits exceed the cost. This requires thorough upfront analysis. Our experience is this upfront work produces better projects, even if a P3 approach is not ultimately the preferred option, as it requires a more systematic consideration of costs, risks, and performance expectations. In general, P3s are more suitable for larger, more complex projects where performance expectations can be clearly specified and are stable over time. Canada is recognized as a global leader in P3s. While P3s have a long history in places such as the United Kingdom and Australia, increasingly people are looking to the Canadian experience. With the ability to draw on the experiences of other jurisdictions, Canada has been able to apply best practices and lessons learned to create a market that is now leading the way. In May of this year, PPP Bulletin, an industry trade publication, conducted a survey to determine the top P3 markets. Canada came out on top. Why exactly is Canada leading the way? There are a few reasons. Canada does P3s for the right reasons. The priority is about value for taxpayer. It isn't about off-balance sheet financing, but rather an in-depth value for money analysis to determine if P3 is the best procurement option. Canada has developed strong public sector institutions in the field of P3s. Public corporations and agencies have been created in Alberta, British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick, and federally, which has contributed to sustained project pipeline, imposed the application of accepted methodologies, documentation, and deal structures, and more importantly, has helped to educate and bring awareness to the P3 model. Canada has deep and cost-effective capital markets. Canada is not reliant on long-term bank financing for projects, which has become less available and costly since the financial crisis. Rather, Canada has been able to employ bond market solutions, which has allowed projects to close at competitive rates of financing. Canada is also open to strong competition, creating a highly competitive market. This ensures best value for taxpayers. The Canadian market has both strong domestic and international players which partner together to produce excellent results. Canadian success is increasingly making P3 an export business for Canadian industry. Canada has a diverse and growing pipeline. The strong historical deal flow from leading provinces is now being supplemented with projects at the federal and municipal level. The use of P3s is also broadening to new asset classes. This growing and diverse pipeline is increasing experience and is attracting more competition, which results in lower costs for taxpayers. In
2007, the Government of Canada saw an opportunity to leverage its role to generate better P3 solutions through the creation of our organization, PPP Canada, a federal Crown corporation. In addition, the government has appointed a very seasoned board of directors, all with strong private sector experience. Operational since 2009, PPP Canada's business priorities are threefold. We act as a source of expertise and advice on public-private partnership matters through P3 knowledge development and sharing. We have a mandate to identify and advise on the execution of P3 projects undertaken by the federal government, and we work with provinces, territories, municipalities, and First Nations to build public sector expertise. In that context, the corporation administers the merit-based $1.2 billion P3 Canada Fund, which focuses on innovative P3s which will support economic and job growth. PPP Canada is a knowledge organization. We have developed tools and materials to support our work and that of our clients. We have developed relationships with procuring jurisdictions across all levels of government in order to share lessons learned and experiences. We look for opportunities to increase knowledge and capacity while working towards shaping the Canadian P3 market through the promotion of a culture of P3s and the sharing of best practices. Recently, the Government of Canada has closed 2 of its own P3 deals. The Communications Security Establishment Canada Long-Term Accommodation Project here in Ottawa and the RCMP E-Division Headquarters Project in Surrey, BC. Budget 2011 created a new federal P3 screen, whereby federal departments and agencies are required to evaluate the potential for using a P3 for federal infrastructure projects with capital costs of $100 million or more and a life cycle of at least 20 years. Our corporation is currently acting as lead P3 advisor to Transport Canada on the new bridge over the St. Lawrence and the Detroit River International Crossing, as well as working closely with other federal departments and agencies as they apply the screen and assess their projects for P3 viability.
With our federal clients, we focus on advancing the P3 market at the provincial, territorial, municipal, and First Nations level. The $1.2 billion fund allocated over 5 years, a merit-based program that supports P3 infrastructure projects that achieve value for Canadians, develop the Canadian P3 market, and generate significant public benefits. As a result, to date, the government has announced P3 Canada commitments to a total of 12 projects of various models, sizes, and infrastructure classes for a total funding contribution of over $387 million. These investments will in turn leverage more than $1.5 billion in P3 infrastructure investments across Canada. PPP Canada's mandate is to improve the delivery of public infrastructure by achieving better value, timeliness, and accountability to taxpayers through P3s. At PPP Canada, we are committed to working with all levels of government to ensure that Canadians get the best value for their infrastructure dollar. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mr. McBride. We do have a list of witnesses, and first, for the official opposition, the NDP, Linda Duncan. 5 minutes, please, Linda.
Questioners.
What did I say?
Witnesses. Happy to witness.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
That's okay.
Okay.
It is
Either
early
way,
Thursday morning.
It is. It was a late night, too.
Last day. Thank you very much, Mr. McBride. I've noticed in the materials in your presentation there has been more than $1 billion committed to the end of this fiscal year. Can you provide to us, and you don't have to give us all the details right now, to the committee, the breakdown in the money spent on establishing this P3 unit and the amount of money that is actually committed to building infrastructure and the amount of money that is actually given to all the government departments to manage P3 facilities?
Sure, to provide information on our own budget, and sort of our budget also, just as a sort of reminder, provides has the three components, both to provide sort of develop knowledge around P3s, to work with the federal government, and to deliver the
right. I understand the
fund.
mandate. You don't have to give me the figures right now, but I like the breakdown. And if you are aware of, if you could provide the information, but we'll have further witnesses on whether or not any of this federal money that's committed for developing and managing for the long-term P3 projects, are any of those dollars actually allocated to the departments that have to manage those projects? You mentioned that there has been experience with P3s in Canada and a great deal of success. I'm afraid that there are some exceptions in the province I come from, Alberta. The Bovar P3 has been an abject disaster, costing Albertans $500 million to bail out the company. So understandably, there's a high level of skepticism for any P3 at any level of government in Alberta because of that. I'm wondering if you could provide to us if there has been any audits done of any of the P3 projects that the federal government has been engaged in, and where the period of the audit, for example, would it be correct for me to presume that your office established is not only developing the system and helping to train departments, but also auditing whether or not the system is really saving the money that they are professed to save to taxpayers?
We certainly, on that last question, we certainly do value for money analysis on these kinds of things. Obviously, the role of auditing the federal government falls to the Auditor General. Our organization is subject to audit of both special examinations and sort of audit by the Auditor General in terms of their responsibilities. On your first point, I would just point out to the committee that the term P3 is broadly and loosely applied by many people in different contexts, ranging from sort of any kind of engagement with the private sector to, in fact, situations where significant long-term private capital is applied. So I just would note to the committee that when you're calling witnesses, people have different definitions of what a P3 is. I wouldn't want to speak particularly about the project that you identified in Alberta, but they have had significant success in the construction of ring roads in Edmonton as P3s, both delivering them on time, on budget, and faster. I can't speak specific to the project you're saying, but if there was, in fact, significant private sector capital at risk in the way that a P3 project should be constructed, then they wouldn't be on the hook for bailing out the company because their money would be the one that would be at risk. But
that actually is a question that I wanted to ask you. I've just been brought to my attention that, as you've mentioned in your presentation, the P3 screening requirement is being imposed on every federal government department. And as a result of that, Minister Duncan proposed P3 for building First Nations schools. I understand, I think it was yesterday, was roundly rejected by all of the First Nations. So it's a twofold question. What is the decision-making process? Who actually makes the final decision whether or not the P3 will be pursued? And who decides on the terms of those undertakings? You've spoken about the risk of the private capital, but where's the protection in those agreements for the risk of the public investment if that project goes under or if there's cost overruns?
On the first question of sort of the $100 million screen, that's a Treasury Board policy. We, as a source of expertise, we advise departments on the application of the screen. And I would point out that the screen is only to identify whether P3 is a viable option. If it is a viable option, then a full-blown P3 procurement options analysis would have to be done.
Who decides if it's viable? Is it the minister of each department or the P3 office or cabinet?
The departments apply the screen themselves. They can consult us. We provide them advice on whether or not we share their view. It is a requirement to consult us. At the end of the day, that's a responsibility of the department, on those kinds of things. And ultimately, departments are accountable to the Treasury Board for the application of this policy.
And are there safeguards in the agreements?
On the question of the structure of the agreements, I can speak to the two from sort of the RCMP and the Canadian Security Establishment Agency. Absolutely, both of those projects have significant private sector capital at risk, and the project agreements involve no payments to the private sector until the project is complete and certified by an independent engineer. So all of their money is at risk. No federal money is at risk until they have delivered. If something would have happened or would happen in the course of those projects, it hasn't. But if something had, it would be first the equity investors and then the debt investors who would be responsible for remediating the situation, or they would lose their money and the federal government would take over that asset and will not have paid a nickel into the project. So that's why it's important for these types of contractual structures to be well established, so that you are ensuring that private sector capital is at risk, because that is what underpins the discipline for performance and actually ensures that risk is transferred. That's why I say if you take a look at different things, some people will call something a P3, but if there isn't significant private sector capital at risk, then I would argue it's not really a P3. It could be an outsourcing relationship. There's lots of contractual relationships that governments have with the private sector, and some people broaden the definition of P3 to include those. My view is that something's a P3 only when there's significant private sector capital at risk.
Why is it a P2?
It would be a P2.
Just kidding. Okay. Sorry. Next, Peter. I'm sorry. We're not using Peter? Bernard. I'm sorry, Bernard is next then.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. McBride, for coming in. Before asking you a couple of questions, just wanted to salute the Chair, and kind of the spirit of this committee is that we're really working across party lines in the sense that it's a general spirit of inquiry. We're trying to examine this long-term critical challenge for Canada and in terms of P3 investments. And so we'll always be advocates. I mean, we're partisan in our way, but we really try and we're just trying to understand today around the advantages and disadvantages of P3, what are some of the pitfalls and what can we learn. You mentioned in some of your remarks that Canadian firms have developed a lot of expertise. And if you think about the Confederation Bridge, that was a great example of a P3 where very big engineering challenge, big financial challenge. And some of the firms that were involved in getting that construction project brought to fruition and then operating it over the life of it, Straight Crossing is one company. Now it's using that expertise that it developed, and it's doing P3 projects around the world. They're working on the Metro Transit tunnels in Seattle, the Gdansk grain terminal in Poland, for example. And another of the partners was Borealis Infrastructure, which is an interesting entity because they're owned by OMERS, the Ontario Municipal Employee Retirement System, and they've got about $50 billion in P3 assets that they're investing in about 20 investments around the world. Some of their portfolio is things that aren't traditional infrastructure. It's things like a satellite that's providing North American distribution services, and Life Labs providing diagnostic services. So what is it about Canada? What makes us such a good country to actually, as a base for being a worldwide leader in P3s?
Those are great points, and I appreciate there is a lot to learn about P3s, and it's an excellent area, so I'm really delighted that the committee is spending some time and trying to understand this. Canada has emerged as a global leader, and you're quite right. Its companies are now both as investors, as sort of engineers, as concerned, taking their expertise internationally. One of the things I said that has made Canada a global leader is that we're doing P3s for the right reason. So to the point that's raised before, not all P3s are a success, and they're not a success if you do them for the wrong reason. So if you look internationally, in fact, even if you look back in Canada 20 years ago, there was a big drive. P3s were actually a way for some governments to do things off budget. So Canada has been very clear about its public accounting standards. P3 projects are on budget. It's not a way of avoiding the capital budget discipline. It's about efficiency and effectiveness. So it's not trying to skirt budget rules, which in some circumstances it has been in some countries, and that's particularly in the European context. But it's actually a technocratic question of whether or not this will deliver better value for money, and therefore, if you're driven by better value for money, then you'll end up with the right result. Canadian capital markets are strong, so we have significant life insurance, bond market. We have, unlike other countries, created institutional capacity. So you'll see organizations like Infrastructure Ontario, Partnerships BC. These are complex projects, and they are complex commercial deals. So actually bringing, and it's not the kind of thing that an average department does on a regular basis, because they tend to be the larger, more complex projects. So by consolidating and bringing in the right expertise to actually execute these deals, there's been significant success. I mean, the build-out of the health system in Ontario through P3 has been enormous success, and Sea to Sky Highway. I mean, you can go through a number of examples, and true in Alberta, where they have sort of built a unit within their Treasury board. So that institutional capacity has been quite effective, and competition, right? By having very strong competition and very clear rules for competition, it's made Canadian companies stronger, because they've been able to partner with other people to so some of that experience that they've partnered with international firms, they have learned and they have developed, and they've been able to use that as a springboard into other projects. But it's one of those ones that, if you actually have a competitive market, it makes both the domestic industry stronger and gets you better value for taxpayers.
So what I'm hearing, it's the different components of that knowledge economy. You talk about the legal system, the financial system, engineering expertise, and just those competitive markets. That's what makes it a vibrant, reality when it comes to building not just Canada, but for other projects around the world. Are there certain jurisdictions, you mentioned Australia and the UK in your comments, are certain jurisdictions known as to be the real leaders, or certain entities known to be the real leaders that we could learn from?
Both the UK and Australia, and to an extent France and other European countries, there are 75 countries with P3 programs. I think there's lessons to be learned from them all, in both good and bad. All right. We've learned about value for money analysis. We've learned about how to deal with operating and maintenance through the life cycle of these kinds of things. We've also learned sort of other lessons that are you got to make sure that you keep it as a tool in a toolbox, that you don't sort of say, well, P3s are the solution to everything, because they're not the solution for everything. And if you try to apply, it's like any tool, if you try to apply a hammer to the wrong kind of situation, you'll get the wrong result. But that's nothing wrong with the hammer. You just didn't use it in the right circumstances. And I think the UK is kind of going through that I think that they've learned that they've done it for some projects that were frankly too small. So where it works and where it doesn't work are some of the things that we can certainly learn. But in Australia, it's very much at the state level, in the state of Victoria and the state of New South Wales. So Partnerships Victoria is a place to learn from. And I think the experience that the UK is going through, where they're realizing that they have probably gone sort of too far in the PFI initiative, is another sort of good lesson for Canada as well.
Great, thank you.
Concludes your time, Bernard. Thank you very much. Next for the NDP, Denis Blanchette. 5 minutes, Denis.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Mr. McBride. I'm glad you're with us this morning. At the beginning of your presentation, I was a bit disappointed. During a large part of the presentation, we were talking about what P3s are in an ideal world. I would have liked to hear a bit more about what you've done. You said at one point that we're a leader, we're an example. I'd like to hear how. I haven't heard the how yet. I haven't seen it. I would like to know, for example, you said earlier, when we've got P3 structures, we have good contracts, but I'd like for you to talk about that. Could you table what your contractual structure is in order to show us how contracts the government concludes with P3s are safe and secure for taxpayers? I would appreciate that. You spoke about the fact that up until now you've financed 12 projects, $387 million. What type of funding is that? On what aspects do you provide funding? Is it just for liquidities? Is it to lower interest rates? I'd like to hear about that. Thank you. The contractual structures, well, I'm very happy. It's difficult to share about specific contracts, but contractual structures are very complex. They're legal agreements, but we can provide examples of structures to you. And there are many parts of a contractual structure, and it's a real education to see something like that. If you have the patience to go through a whole project. Concerning our financing, we have our $1.2 billion fund. At the beginning, we thought a lot about how to add value to the P3 market. We spoke with the private sector, the public sector. The feedback we got, and I think it's the reality, is that the private sector in the P3 industry doesn't need government help. There's expertise from the industry. It's strong. Capital markets are deep and competitive. So our focus is on the public sector. Our contributions, our investments are in provinces and municipalities and First Nations. So for our project, we help provinces and municipalities with expertise, especially municipalities that don't have much experience with P3s. And we also help with the affordability of projects. Our contributions are given to the provinces and municipalities. So the money you have that you spend is not within the federal government. It's at other levels of government that you spend it. The 12 projects you were talking about are not federal government projects. They're from other levels of government. Is that right? Yes. Our fund is only for projects from other levels of government. We work with federal departments, but the resources for federal projects come from the capital budget of departments. Okay, so since you've been created, how many projects have you assessed for the federal government until now? About a dozen. About a dozen. How many have passed the screening? What was the result? We can talk about projects that have already been closed. The RCMP project, for example, that was built in Surrey, British Columbia. It was almost finished. There's the project here in Ottawa for the Communications Security Establishment, which is being built now. We can also talk about the two major projects, the bridges to replace the Champlain Bridge in Montreal, and also the Detroit River project. The other projects are at preliminary phases. They're in the planning process at the department level. Have you refused any? Have you said that in some cases, no, it's not a good project, and why? For the P3 model, yes. And why? Why? A number of reasons. From time to time, are the performance expectations, is it possible to properly set performance expectations? Will these performance expectations be stable over a long period of time? Let's take, for example, IT, information technology. These are significant investments, but is it really possible for the private sector to enter into a 25-year contract with the federal government to invest in IT? It's very difficult because over a 25-year period, the situation in the IT world will change a great deal. So that's one example. And an example where the risks aren't easy to transfer to the private sector. Let's take, for example, military equipment in a war situation. How can the government transfer the risks of maintaining that equipment over the life of a vehicle? How can the private sector manage that? For P3, the question is, who is best positioned to manage risks? In a context where the private sector is better positioned to manage risks, let's take a construction project, for example, a maintenance project for a bridge. The experience, the expertise of the private sector is better for managing the risks in a construction project for a bridge. We can determine pretty easily what the government wants over a 25-year period. We want a bridge that can accommodate X number of cars, vehicles. Give us a solution that is the least costly over a 25-year period, including maintenance. Design that project, build that project, maintain that project. And if the results do not meet the performance requirements, the payments are affected. But it's not always a situation where the performance expectations are stable over 25 years. Or the public sector is better positioned. Thank you.
But I think it's in our interest to let the witness fully explain the answers. So that crept on a little long, but now Jacques Gourd's turn. 5 minutes, Jacques, or thereabouts.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. McBride, for being here today. I'd like to come back on what you've said. For the benefit of Canadians, it's good to well understand P3s, their structure, and as public managers of taxpayer money, sometimes we have to take long-term decisions regarding infrastructure, and you've started to properly explain the contribution of P3s, and perhaps by bringing in the history of P3s, where they come from, with a few examples, you could show us how, as you've just said, there are things that are difficult to take into account with technology, for example, when things change very quickly. In the private sector, people might be better able to manage risks. There's also public infrastructure. So I like how you started to explain that, and perhaps you could continue. Thank you. The roots of P3s come from experience with the traditional model. We must remember that it's always the private sector that contributes to public infrastructure. The public sector doesn't have the equipment to build bridges and roads and all of that. So traditionally, the government would conclude a contract, a separate contract, to build a project. After that, it would be received as a design. And then there's a call for tenders for building the project. And then the infrastructure is received, and something is needed for the maintenance. So what's the problem with that? The person who designs the infrastructure has no incentive to build the project with the least amount of costs possible. We receive designs that are very difficult to build. The person who is responsible for building the infrastructure has no incentive to think about the long-term maintenance of the project. And when there's a problem, when there's a cost overrun in the construction phase, the builder says, oh, well, it's a design problem. The person who designed the project says, no, it's the builder's problem. In that situation, who's responsible? Well, the government pays. So it's clear that public projects have problems in the traditional model, where cost overruns for a project happen normally. And one of the major problems now in the country is not building new infrastructure, but rather maintaining infrastructure that already exists. So governments haven't examined systematically the life cycle of infrastructure. So P3s are an answer to those problems. In addition, when federal governments have cost overruns, what happens? It's always the government that pays. How do we change the procurement process to prevent problems? Two big things. Put the same person in charge for all of the phases and let them optimize costs. So they would be responsible for the design, as well as construction, as well as maintenance. There's no way to say that someone else did X, Y, Z. So that's one of the major components of the P3 model, the integration. So it's not just about building infrastructure. It's about services that come with the infrastructure. If the infrastructure doesn't work, if it doesn't meet the expectations of the public, how do we ensure that it will be done properly? The only way is to use the discipline of capital markets to require builders, the private sector, to meet performance expectations. I often say that governments aren't very adept at having a good return on their money when there's a problem, but they're very good at not giving money at the beginning. So give money only when the project is achieved. There's no way for anyone. And while bankers require that, these are loans and investments of hundreds of millions of dollars. Bankers can require discipline from investors, from the private sector, that governments can't.
Concludes your time. So, Mr. McBride. John McCallum for the Liberals.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you.
People like to say Canada is a world leader in just about everything. And that's nice when it's true, but sometimes it's not true. And you talk about this survey by PPP Bulletin where Canada comes out on top. I would have thought countries like UK, Australia had greater depth and history than we did. So are you really saying Canada is number one in the world? And if so, what is PPP Bulletin? And by what measure are we number one?
You're right that UK and Australia has more experience, so they've been at it longer and have done more projects. So what I say now is that Canada has sort of emerged. And
no,
so,
but you said Canada, we're top. That means we're one.
Right. And you measure in terms of where we are right now.
We're number one.
Yeah, and I would say why is that? Number one reason is this is an emergence post-financial crisis. And number one reason is that certainly in the European markets, the financial structure for the deals have been on long-term bank financing. And therefore, post-financial crisis, the banks are not lending long-term, 25-year sort of loans.
Can you tell me what is PPP Bulletin and by what measures we are number one?
Happy to share it with you. PPP Bulletin is an industry trade journal. They did a survey of people.
Published where?
It's published in the UK.
Okay.
And they did, in partnership with Deloitte, did an international survey of participants in PPP. They identified a number of countries and they identified a number of criteria. And so in many respects, Canada has emerged as a leader in that survey. Happy to share the results and the content of that survey.
But you're saying overall we're number one?
In terms of where we are right now with our market.
Okay. You have this fund of $1.2 billion over 5 years. What was the first year?
What was the first year for when we got money?
For the $1.2 billion over 5 years.
How much was it? $162 million.
In what year?
2008, 9, or 9, 10.
So when was the first time?
It would have been 9, 10.
And you spent $162 million in that year?
No, we did not commit $162 million in our first year.
when was the first year you committed significant money?
We have committed significant money last year and even more significant money this year.
Okay, because it seems to me for an institution that's 5 years old, you've gotten off to a very slow start. And we had a very unsuccessful election campaign in 2011, but one of our platform items was that we transfer the money from your organization into affordable housing, because it was our perception you'd done virtually nothing with that money as of, say, 2010. Was that perception correct?
I don't share that perception.
You just told me the first money you spent was last year.
Yes, that's true. I mean, we were created in 2009 as a Crown Corporation. In February 2009, I was appointed. I was employee number 1, and so this was a new approach by the federal government to create an institution. The board of directors was appointed in June of 2009. We launched our first call for applications in September of 2009. So within 6 months, we had put together. We spent some time figuring out what we should do with the fund, and then we launched our first call for applications in September 2009. Those applications were received, and we work with clients on those kinds of things. These are, you're right, these are not projects that happen overnight. They are complex projects. We want, our emphasis is on making sure that we're making the best investments, not the quickest investments, and focusing on projects that actually produce value for money.
In your statement, it says 2007, your organization.
In 2007, in budget 2007, the government announced that it was going to create this fund. And at that time, there was going to be a PPP office. But the actual creation of a Crown Corporation as a separate institution of government, which I would argue is best practice if you take a look at what Ontario and BC and other jurisdictions have done, did take some time. So I can speak to when I arrived in February of 2009, but I think since February 2009, we've made enormous progress, and working to actually develop new approaches to the way public sector does business doesn't happen overnight. And we have seen a significant growth in applications, going from 70 to sort of 200. In our last round, we received $13 billion worth of applications for infrastructure. And we expect that within the next 18 to 24 months, it takes a bit of an exponential growth as you both start up an organization. But I personally, and I know this view is shared by my board, would rather make sure that the money is well spent and spent fast.
Well, thank you. Finally, I think it would be helpful if you don't mind sharing that information from the PPP bulletin.
Absolutely.
I'd be interested in seeing it. It's not that I don't want Canada to be a world leader. It's just I hear everybody saying it all the time about everything, and I'd like to know if it's really true.
Right, and don't get me wrong, we have things to learn from others. There's no doubt about that.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. For the Conservatives, Kelly Block.
So, John, don't touch it, Kelly. They do it.
Wasn't happening fast enough. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. McBride, for being here. It's been a terrific presentation, and I've appreciated the questions that have been asked so far. Perhaps just following up on my colleague's question about how fast we are managing to spend the money. I know that you stated that you work with provinces, territories, municipalities, and First Nations. And I'm just wondering if you could share with us whether or not those partners were ready for what the federal government was intending by creating the P3s, or if capacity needed to be built at those levels as well.
Yes and no. If you go back to the time of 2009, the priority was stimulus. And so if you remember back to the time, there was significant, and for the right reasons, there was a time where the government said, we need to put an injection of stimulus, and infrastructure was one of those tools, and there was an extra $9 or $10 billion added to infrastructure funds in a 2-year window to focus on making sure that the economy moved forward. In that context, those were the same partners. So provinces and municipalities had a 2-year window from 2009 to 2011 to spend $11 billion or $9 or $10 billion. And in our first year, absolutely, almost every province was, and most municipalities were extremely focused on stimulus spending. And by its very nature, those projects were shorter term. And that was. There's nothing wrong with that. That was what the point of them was. So in those first period, the emphasis was really on getting that stimulus money, and that was really well done. Mm-hmm. But it did take a lot of capacity away and focus away in provinces and municipalities from the longer term task and the larger projects. In terms of sort of capacity, there are provinces that have, in fact, things that I wouldn't want to get in terms of being a global leader. I would say our provinces are global leaders in Infrastructure Ontario and Partnerships BC, and I've been very lucky. Our organization's been very lucky to be able to learn from them and their experiences. So the credit for that doesn't us, global leader, doesn't go to us, but goes to what's been happening at the provincial level. So there is capacity, but it's uneven. So BC, Alberta, Quebec have been doing P3s, and so they have capacity. They each have established institutions who have expertise to do these kinds of things. That's less true in other provinces. For example, we just announced a couple of weeks ago an investment for P3 to redevelop the Iqaluit Airport. So the Nunavut territory, to sort of say, well, did it have a lot of knowledge and capacity about how to do complex project structures like this? No. Did that take a lot of work? Did we work to get BC to partner with Nunavut to help them learn and have capacity to make sure that they do the deal right? So that's true with municipalities. We've worked with Winnipeg and Surrey and Sudbury and a whole range of municipalities. In fact, it's one of the goals of our fund to try and focus on people. I mean, yes, we want to leave behind great infrastructure. That should go without saying. Yes, we want to leave behind great PPPs that deliver value for money. But what we really want to leave behind is an institutional capacity and a learning. So part of our challenge is to work and partner with people that are new to P3s, and even those that are more experienced. Want to encourage them to try, can we do P3s in areas where they haven't done them before? So we're doing a project with Partnerships BC, who's very experienced, to do the rehabilitation of single residence occupancy, basically social housing in Eastside Vancouver. So those are the 100-year historic buildings. So how do you actually get the private sector to take the risk over 25 years of rehabilitating and providing social housing in Eastside Vancouver? Not obvious, but if we could come up with a social housing model for rehabilitation of social housing to engage the private sector, then there may be something that everybody could learn from across the country. But not an easy deal to put together. So we're working with people that have experience to get them to take their experience into new places, and with jurisdictions that haven't. So the capacity is a challenge, as was the short-term stimulus focus in the 2009 to 2011 period, which I would sort of say, did cause some slowdown or take-up. But I'd have to say we were just getting started too, and we wanted to walk before we ran as well.
Over your time, but thank you very much. That concludes our first round of questioning. In the meantime, if you don't mind my taking a minute for one question, generally in the industry, and this is why we asked you here, is not to necessarily find out the efficacy of what you're doing, but more about the industry. But what's an acceptable profit margin? I mean, what is the markup? If a bridge costs $100 million to build and maintain over 25 years, you don't do it, it's not a charitable, it's not, you're not doing it out of the goodness of your heart, you're trying to make money on it.
Right.
So do we pay more, how much more do we pay for having somebody else do it than the real cost of the project?
Well, if you recall, a P3 is sort of pulling all the pieces of a project into one transaction, and then underpinning with discipline of finance. So, if you were going to ask somebody, say you're going to do a bridge, and you're going to do it in the traditional mode, you'd have to hire an engineering firm to design the bridge, and they would make a profit on that. So P3 doesn't sort of change the contractual relationships and what they make on a profit. If you were going to then hire PCL or Ellis Dawn to construct the bridge, or Straight Crossing to construct the bridge, there would be a profit margin in that. If you're going to hire somebody to operate the bridge, there'd be a profit margin in that. By putting the pieces together, they actually optimize the cost. So to ask what is the profit margins that companies charge in terms of their contractual relationships, and even within the consortium, they have contractual relationships between each other, right? If the question is, what is the incremental cost of the finance, right? Spreads on the debt component, which are usually about 90% of the financing, are around 200 basis points over what governments could borrow. Right, so there is a cost to the long-term finance.
But one of the main themes of your presentation, sir, was that you're asking the private sector to come in and take on the risk.
Yes.
You don't take on the risk without some reward.
That's the incremental cost of the finance, yeah.
Only.
Yeah, and in fact, I would argue that you get better value on the other component, right? So you get better value by design, construction, operation, and by the competitive process of putting that all together. I mean, that is the tenet of that in terms of not only the competitive process brings discipline, but the whole life cycle optimization, the ability to sort of, the person who's thinking through design is also building, is also maintaining, forces the best possible value. So
that's. I didn't take up too much time. I was just interested if there was a clean answer. 10% markup.
You'd have to ask the industry that. I mean, they would vary on the industry and the contractor about how it is that they price their projects.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you, Jean-François Larose.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witness. I have a few questions. Perhaps you could note them because our time is very short. I appreciate your patience. As you know very well, what's happening currently in Quebec with the Chartrand Commission, and earlier you were mentioning that you are keeping track of the different issues that happen with P3s. There were scandals in Quebec. It's before the courts, it's close to home, and it's been 30 years that we've heard that P3s are working, but we're still seeing problems. Earlier you were mentioning Great Britain, and I think they have a committee that dealt with a number of scandals there. As an example, for us, I find that a bit odd, and even here in Ontario, we see correctional services and the ambulance scandal. It was a total disaster. I have a number of questions, so I'll start. What mechanisms do you have in place to ensure an adjudication process that is impartial and transparent, and to have accountability that's transparent? How will you ensure that events that are happening in Great Britain with private companies that take advantage of P3s to the detriment of taxpayers don't happen here? What mechanisms do you have in place to ensure that citizens, and us as well as MPs, are aware of the amount of taxes going into this? And more specifically, how do you assess the costs the Crown would incur if the project wasn't done with the private sector? What would the costs be if we stuck with traditional concepts, as you mentioned earlier? How do you calculate the return on taxpayers' money invested in P3s? You say that those returns until now Well, can you tell us what the returns are for private companies? Do you have documents to support this that you could share with this committee? A good series of questions. He took note of them. In terms of transparency, a requirement for our investment for provinces and municipality is a requirement to publish the value added, their study on the value added, which examines the costs of a traditional model compared to the P3 model. So that's a requirement on an investment from us. That analysis must be published. So how to prevent the problems that Great Britain ran into? It's a value-added analysis for each project. And we have to ensure that the reason why someone is proposing a P3 is not to avoid budgetary constraints. So that's within our accounting requirements in Canada. They're different than what exists in Europe. Assessments of costs? Yes, we assess the costs. How do we make a decision? Well, there are two. We'll take two questions together. How do we assess the return? Well, there are two sorts of returns on a project. One that isn't linked to P3s. There's a return on projects. Building a bridge will create economic benefits. But if the project is built in a traditional model, the economic benefits of the bridge will exist because the bridge exists. The comparison we draw is it more efficient to do this project within a P3 model or a traditional model? So we look at the costs of the traditional model. There's a whole way of analyzing the costs of a traditional model, including the risks, and then we assess P3s. So that can be done at the beginning with estimates, and then we do it again when we receive applications from the private sector to ensure that what the private sector is proposing is less costly than the traditional model. If it's not the case, we don't make that investment. Or our recommendation to the government is to not proceed with that project. So it's all about analyzing these things. I think I've answered all of your questions. Did I miss any?
Thank you. What does that say? I'm sorry. Mr. Shizu.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. McBride, to appear in the front of our commission. I'm a professional engineer, so I will go on that aspect of the P3 projects.
Good.
I like very much the concept. The concept is excellent. And you were mentioning in your presentation about the screening projects over 100 million. And you mentioned mostly about, in your presentation and your examples, about the infrastructure projects under the P3 scenario. You also specifically mentioned that the project involving the Communication Security Establishment Canada long-term accommodation, and in that an independent engineer will give a verdict on the completion and how it is. So my question to you is how the engineering aspects, the design aspects, is evaluated in the P3 projects, such as design or other engineering aspects, and in your organization, how you are advising the other departments about this is the correct project, this is the correct design, this is the correct concept. Do you have any engineering professional on your staff? Because I think that a lot of times, if you don't have a correct design, and of course combined with the project management institute recommendation, PMBOK, and all the other stuff. If you don't have that one, for sure a project is deemed to fail. And it's costing taxpayers' money, and I don't want taxpayers' money to be expended. I understand very much. I am not an expert in finances, but that is the design. The design is a very important aspect for any project in infrastructure.
Absolutely. In terms of the design process, the first step is for the public sector to define performance expectations. Not the how, not how thick should the concrete be, or how sort of those kind of how many bolts should be on the thing, but what should be the outputs, the performance. What performance do we want at the end of the day? In general, then we would go to between 20 and 30% design. The 20 and 30% design is to allow for a reasonable cost estimation. We don't go farther than 30% design because you want to leave scope for the private sector to come up with the best design to achieve the performance specifications. So as part of the bid process, the bidders would have to complete to 100% design and do cost estimates. So they're at risk in their bids of having to go from sort of taking that 20 and 30 and going to 100% design and putting that forward. And then those designs are evaluated based on whether they're technically compliant with the performance specifications that have been put out. But you leave them that kind of scope to allow for innovation. That's why there are greater upfront costs for bidders in a P3, because as part of their bid, they have to complete that design and costing work. So there's a fair bit of upfront work and more risk for the private sector in having to do that. So that's basically how it works.
How you are assuring that they are in the design-build concept, not in design-bid-build? How you are sure that the materials are, the safe and the safety of the public is maintained?
That there is an independent engineer through the course of the process that has to certify that what they're doing is right. So we rely, and these are not only hired by the public authority, but hired by, and even more importantly, by the investors, who report to the investors on whether or not these things, because if something goes wrong on performance, they do the wrong kinds of things, that will come back to the company and the investors because they won't get paid. And so the investors also have investors, but it's absolutely through independent engineering advice. That leaves the government with a situation when the independent engineer certifies, only then and only then do we pay. Right? So we rely on independent engineering advice for payments.
Speaking about the independent engineer, who is hiring the independent engineer and who are the costs involved in this one? Are you choosing the independent engineers are you recommending it, or it's the public sector who is choosing that?
So it depends on the project we're involved in. So if we were working with a province or a municipality, and we're a funder of a project that they're executing, they would select the independent engineer. If it was a federal project, then the federal government would select the independent engineer.
Thank you, Mr. Chizou. Next, Linda and Denis will share a time slot. Is that correct?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Good questions. Looking forward to reviewing your proceedings. Under the trade agreements that are in place and the government is pursuing, increasingly contracts are opened up to foreign entities. Do P3s allow for foreign entities, and if so, how do you provide for enforcement of those contracts? My second question is the bidding process different for P3 project? In other words, when the department comes to you with its proposal, has it already put out the call for bids and has an idea what the cost might be? Are there many stages to this? Do you now have a completely different bidding process in the government for P3s, which would also include the cost of long-term maintenance?
Great question. There are foreign players that are here in Canada that are bidding. Hochtief's, Bouygues from France, Carillion from. These are companies that have established Canadian components. Those companies partner with Canadian companies. The reality is when they're bringing capital or expertise, the reality is these works happen here in Canada. Therefore, the vast majority of the economic benefits, the employment, you don't ship concrete from Germany to sort of build things here. In terms of enforcement, these are contractual agreements set under Canadian law and are enforced under Canadian law. How do you ensure that you can realize on any kind of contractual difficulty? Well, you haven't paid them yet. Their private sector capital is at risk. So that's not only do you have the contractual outcomes, but you have got the hammer of their money at risk to ensure enforcement of the contractual obligations. In terms of the bidding process, it's different, but the principles are fundamentally the same. When we're talking with federal departments, it's long before the bid process. This is when projects are being conceptualized. We want to do X, Y, or Z, and there's quite a process. Is a P3 the right approach? Potentially. And then a more detailed analysis of the issues, the risks, the costs. When you're going to construct a project or undertake a project with just a capital cost of over $100 million, there's a significant amount of upfront work. So we're sort of involved in the upfront work. When it comes to the bidding process, it's a two-stage process with both an RFQ and then an RFP process. Given the fact, as was identified, that bidders actually have to take things through the design, it's actually a lot of cost for a bidder to put forward a proposal. So generally, 3 companies are qualified from the RFQ list, and those bids are evaluated during the whole course of the process. Another mandatory sort of requirement of us is that an independent fairness monitor must be hired, who monitors the bidding process and has to produce an independent report on its transparency and its fairness.
I think the time's to be shared with Jean-François Larose. Is that correct?
Ça va être une question ce fois-là.
It'll be one question this time. Just to correct something, earlier I mentioned the Chartrand Commission, but it's the Charbonneau Commission. It's been 30 years that we've had P3s in Quebec. When we're on the roads, we see that bridges are falling. Earlier you said that the risk is largely put on the private sector, and that's a concern because with the fluctuations in the market and for a number of reasons that we're not aware of, over the long term, often these projects take years. I'm wondering what mechanisms are in place to control this, to ensure there's good quality, and that the fluctuations that exist, that private companies, they don't tend to have these hidden problems, and we're seeing this more and more, that they're coming to light now. The disciplined method in the process, well, there are 2 methods. There's the contractual agreement. There's the contractual agreement that sets out performance standards. So it requires follow-up. That's a partnership. We talk about a P3, a public-private partnership. So it's a partnership, yes, but it's a contractual relationship. Inaudible. Yes, it's based on a legal structure where the obligations of each party are clearly defined. So in other terms, if something falls on a person from a bridge 20 years later, we can sue them. So there's no guarantee that it won't fall. Is there ever a guarantee that nothing, but the public sector, well, there are inspectors that are present throughout the process, yes, because it's a contractual relationship with the government. There's nothing that reduces safety standards. As we said at the beginning, there's an assessment by an independent engineer of what is being done. And so the project is assessed. But now we're talking about at the beginning. I'm talking about the long term. Well, long term, the reality of long-term infrastructure is that the long-term infrastructure problem is a lack of maintenance. That governments aren't investing enough in maintaining infrastructure, current infrastructure. The benefits of P3s are that P3 set out at the beginning agreements. They set out a budget. So it's not possible for governments to not maintain infrastructure. I'm sure that if you invite witnesses and ask about problems with bridges that are falling, the two problems are design problems at the beginning or a lack of maintenance. So P3s try to address those two issues by integrating design with building and maintenance. And they set out in a contract, it's an obligation for the government to pay for maintenance. Too often, governments say there are budget cuts, we'll put off to later maintaining that infrastructure. But it's not possible with the P3.
Peter Braid, finally.
Finalement. Thank you, merci, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. McBride, for being here. I certainly, appreciate the update today and your presentation, and understand that you've really had the twin priority of both creating a brand new federal government department and Crown Corporation, and everything that entails, and at the same time execute your mandate. I think I heard earlier that you've thus far, in the early phases of your mandate, approved 12 projects. I'm just curious to know what the nature of those projects are, what the majority of those projects are. Are these municipal? Are they bridges? Are they roads? What does the majority of these projects look like?
Thank you. They're quite diverse. And that's in fact one of the things we've been looking for, diverse in terms of who and diverse in terms of what. Examples, we've worked with the City of Winnipeg to do the Chief Peguis Trail, which is a significant portion of essentially a ring road in Winnipeg, delivered a year early and under budget. We've worked with Urban Transit in Montreal to build a train maintenance facility in Montreal. We've wastewater treatment in Kananaskis, the Evan Thomas project. In Sudbury on Biosolid, which is the last part of wastewater treatment project in Sudbury. In Lac La Biche, a very small community, on water treatment. Barrie on their urban transit, but in that case a bus operation where they are engaging the private sector to provide full bus operation in the city of Barrie. With BC government on social housing, Go Transit in Toronto.
Okay. Excellent.
A whole range of things.
A wide array and
all across the country
and
municipalities and provinces and a whole range of sectors.
I have two universities in my riding in Kitchener-Waterloo, two great universities. Is post-secondary education infrastructure eligible under P3, and if not, why not?
The infrastructure categories that are eligible are set by my shareholder. Broadly speaking, educational infrastructure is not, mostly respecting the constitutional jurisdiction of the two levels of government.
Okay, understood. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions on how we, generally speaking, raise the profile of P3s in Canada and increase the number of projects that you're involved in?
Well, events like this, thank you very much for the awareness. I appreciate that. We
Here's
do
your
lots of
commercial
things. Yeah,
opportunity.
we do lots of things. For example, we last year ran 26 workshops across the country in every province and territory in partnership with provinces, engaging over 500 municipal and provincial decision makers who are dealing with real projects. We're at industry associations as the National Regional Infrastructure Summit, getting a dialogue about P3s. I think the real way of doing it, and I think that's true for everybody, is people want to see it in practice. So our real goal is to give good examples of how it can be done well and how it works. And that's why we're looking at doing it at the municipal level, and to have, in fact, the best champions and awareness builders are our clients. So if you sort of had Mayor Katz here, and he could speak about his personal experience in sort of as a mayor and he'll now speak about that to other kinds of people. So we're gradually creating a network, and also, how do we connect a network of people on these kinds of things? So the profile has gone up quite a bit. I can sort of say that we have seen over 200 applications. The interest in terms of volume and numbers of projects have been exponential since our start.
Great. My final question is a question about financing. You've spoken both in your presentation and in responses to questions about the fact that risk is transferred to the private sector. Risk obviously has a cost. The private sector will build in cost for risk. In addition, appropriately so, the private sector needs to make money. So given those conditions, how are these arrangements good for the taxpayer?
That's a great question, and that is one of the most fundamental points of a P3, and that's why it doesn't work in all circumstances. And the question is, who's best able to manage that risk? And so, is that risk, if the government was to take it, cost it more than if the private sector was to take it? So, if the government was to do a procurement in its traditional way, what's the probability of a cost overrun? So we do quite a bit. We look at empirical evidence. We do workshops with experts about what's the probability and the likelihood. I mean, we do it on a whole, the risk register, a whole set of risks. So there's quite a systematic evaluation of the risks, probability, and results. And we do things called Monte Carlo simulations to figure out what the evaluation of those kinds of risks. And then the question is, that's what those risks are worth, will likely cost the government. Is the private sector better able to manage those risks? And they will charge you for them, but will they charge you less than what if you did them on our circumstances? So the projects that's why if it's a low risk standard, you're building sidewalks, you're replacing the sidewalks. But if you're building the Sea to Sky Highway from Vancouver to Whistler up that coast, if any of you have driven on it, and take up the engineering and the issues of that Sea to Sky Highway, significant engineering and complexities in that kind of project, or a major hospital and the rest of that. But they can manage those kinds of risks better, and they will charge you, and that's the evaluation. And if they can't, you don't do a P3, and if they can, you do. Right? And it's really a technocratic evaluation like that. We have our investments on average, our estimates, well, I mean, you have to see what it is in reality, are about 8% better value for the projects that we invest in. So on $1.5 billion of projects, because we invest only 25% in the projects, right? On $1.5 billion of projects on an average of 8%, right? That's 120 or 30 million. I'll do my math. It's 120 or 30 million dollars of better value for the taxpayer. Plus, we're getting the infrastructure.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you,
John McCallum.
Yeah, if I can just briefly go back to my previous points. Are you able to tell us, out of this $1.2 billion, what we spent in 2009, 10, 10, 11, 11, 12, and perhaps projections for 12, 13?
I can certainly tell you what's committed, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, because I think that would be useful. Now, you've talked a lot about, sometimes a P3 is good, sometimes a P3 isn't good.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like it if you could tell us, with concrete examples or criteria, the types of things where it's not good. I mean, I can think of traditional areas where P3s are often used, like highways and bridges and hospitals and maybe even prisons, although that would be controversial, airports. So is it a question of scale and complexity, or?
Those would be the two most important factors, but there are others. So size, right? It's not a good thing for. I mean, people have different views, and it's a bit different depending on the sector. And you got to think of size, both capital cost and operating. But less than $50 million a capital cost. Why is that? That's both a question of the transaction cost. So there's the same sort of bid cost to these kinds of things if it's a $200 million project, if it's a $50 million. So to attract the interest of the private sector and really get good competition and to really justify the incremental transaction cost, which is part of the weighing of these kinds of things, it has to be of a certain type of scale.
Okay.
Right? Second one is risk. Right, so that's complexity, but what is the risk of the private sector? Partly that's complexity, and partly that's actually correlated with scale. So large projects tend to be riskier, but risk is also a question of experience. So if it's a project you don't do very often, right, like you're a regional health authority, and you build a hospital once in a generation, it's probably better to engage somebody who's built 50 hospitals rather than sort of learning on your own. So it's kind of what is your own expertise in being able to deliver that. So that's
generally you're saying the greater the risk, the more likely you want a P3.
Correct. So, and then the third one would be your ability to transfer that risk to the private sector. Right? If there's a lot of risk, but you can't transfer it to the private sector. So what's an example of that? Things where you can't transfer it efficiently to the private sector. So what would be inefficient things to transfer to the private sector? Often permitting risk is a difficult risk to transfer because it's with the public sector. Where risk of external change, right? That's why I mentioned the IT example. That, how will, because the private sector will do anything for you, but they will price that risk. And so is it a price of risk that you think is actually better, or is it a risk that you should take yourself? Right? So it's really a question of how do you partition risk.
If I have time, just one last question. The social housing, I think you mentioned earlier, I'm not sure. That's a pretty difficult one, isn't it?
Yes.
Why is it difficult?
Well, because you're taking existing buildings that are 100 years old, and they've got to rehabilitate them. So how do you deal with the existing? So it's easier for greenfield. If people are looking, how do you do it for rehabilitation? When it's a greenfield, all you're really taking is geotechnical risk on sort of what's there. But, when they're 100-year-old buildings and you start to take down the walls, or you do some of these kinds of things, how do you deal with the fact that how does the private sector going to price a risk it can't know before it actually signs on the contractual line to take that risk? So, how do you deal with that, and how do you give them the best information on the existing state of that? And that only was possible because there had been some done in a traditional way, right? And so they got experience on those types of buildings in Eastside Vancouver, so they're willing to do it. So when you're taking pre-existing risks, much more difficult to legally and contractually split them.
Thank you.
Still got, okay, you're finished, John?
Yep.
Thank you. Next, Ron Cannon.
Mr. Chair, and thanks, Mr. McBride. Coming from British Columbia, well aware of the P3, Mr. Blaine, and Partnerships BC, and Mr. Braid indicated post-secondary. We've got two wonderful post-secondaries, both Okanagan College and UBC Okanagan, which is about $100 million plus of investment. But one great example, if you're looking for one beside the Sea to Sky, is the William R. Bennett Bridge, which is about $144 million 5-lane bridge. That's been, I think, an icon for Partnership BC, and something that if you want to come and take a tour of, you'll come across some, and you'll have some international award-winning wineries at either end too. So just make sure you don't drink and drive. But I wanted to. That one was a design, build, finance, and operate. So maybe you could elaborate to the committee share a little bit about the different models, because that's not, what they call it, there's BOOT and all these other acronyms. So maybe you can enlighten us a little bit on that.
Great question, and absolutely, BC, was the first. We're leaders in the country in the P3 model, and so there are lots of great examples in Quebec. So thank you for flagging that and that time. I talked about how there are various steps or various pieces of doing an infrastructure project. So there's the design, there's the build, there's the operate, maintain, and finance. So those various models of P3, and the P3 is really an umbrella of models, is a question of what's the most efficient procurement mechanism to procure a particular project. Is it the traditional way? Is it a design build? Is it a design build finance? Is it a design build finance maintain? So you can package different things together depending on the outcome. I'll give you an example. Evergreen, we'll stay in BC. The Evergreen line in Vancouver is being procured as a design build finance. Well, hang on, why not include operate and maintain? Well, it's the extension of an existing line, and the integration of that in the operating and maintenance of the other thing, not that effective. In water and wastewater, operation and maintenance is critical because it's actually integral to the success of the project and the very difficult to partition risks for design and build. So it actually requires a very thorough analysis of the various models. And so when you say P3 is one thing, it's actually a grouping of various models, and it's really a technocratic question, what produces the best outcome for the public sector in the various range of models that you can think about.
Thank you. Mentioned earlier in your comments, it's a very complex contractual deal, and discussion with my legislative assistant, who's been on the Hill for a number of years, when they reviewed this P3 model before, talk about there's different templates or guidelines, but every deal is different. And from your experience, is it then the more precise or clear the contract, the less likely of any problems down the road and the better results?
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, these are contractual arrangements, and your ability to negotiate and deal with, have clear and transparent contractual terms makes them easier to manage. It's one of those things of why Canada is a global leader, is that it has established Ontario, BC, standard contractual documentation, so which lowers transaction costs. So the legal review of them every time, you can start with sort of basic templates on contractual documentation. Obviously, performance specifications and things unique to the project, but you don't have to review every single clause again. And they have been amended and updated based on experience as you kind of get better and better contractual relationships. You kind of go, I think if you went back and talked to Larry, you kind of go, well, if I know what I know now, I probably wouldn't have designed that contract. I would have provided this, or I would have provided that. And so we've continually learned and updated the contractual templates. And I've been very fortunate to be able to benefit from Larry's work and David Livingston in Ontario, who have been leaders in Canada on this, and take the best of their best practices and try to apply them at a better level.
It's an evolving learning process. I agree. Thanks. The dollar value, I thought one time they were talking about $50 million, but how did you settle at $100 million?
At the federal level? Yeah, so that was, at the end of the day, that was a government decision. In BC, it's at 50. So Alberta's at 100. I think to start with, and you'd have to ask the Treasury Board and the Department of Finance why at the end of the day they settled on 100, because it was their decision at the end of the day. I think that it's pretty clear that over 100 you should be at least thinking about whether or not a P3 is viable. And I think to get started, I think it was a bit of an 80-20 rule. I think you're going to get 80% of what you should. You will also note it's mandatory over 100 and encouraged for under 100. So it's not that people aren't thinking about it for under 100. But for it to be mandatory, I think people want to make, let's focus on the ones that are likely going to be the ones that are most probably beneficial as P3s.
We've got time for one quick more question here. The value for money analysis, Thanks. One quick question. I looked at you, and you were looking very
accommodating.
Very accommodating. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just value for money analysis, you talked about it is required, but who's in charge of determining those costs?
The value for money analysis?
Yeah.
So, yeah, again, just to be clear, so we have two lines of business. We work with provinces and municipalities, and our fund is only for provinces and municipalities. And those circumstances, the first obligation is on the procuring jurisdiction to produce a value for money analysis, but we will subject that to our own due diligence about whether or not we agree or disagree with it. When it comes to federal projects, at the end of the day, the Treasury Board would review proposals from departments to go forward with capital projects. So at the end of the day, that value for money analysis would be part of their decision-making process. We are producing guidance and guidelines, and we're working with other people about what a federal value for money methodology should look like, drawing in best practice from other jurisdictions.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. So we have the
Are you
Sir John A. MacDonald, great Canadian, Sir John McCallum, and now John McBride. Three Johnnies.
My goodness.
Great Canadian.
Just that kind of day. Great Canadians all. We could agree on that. Just before we let you go, that does conclude our second round. There's one question I have, just of a general nature. I mean, you kind of, in answering questions, said that in the $1.25 billion that went out there, maybe there's an average 8% saving, $125 million. When you're putting that together, do you calculate the fact that by the time the infrastructure project is handed back to the public sector, it probably is at the time when it needs it the most maintenance? For instance, after the 25-year mark, that's when that bridge, when it comes back into our taxpayers' obligation and responsibility again, that's when it's probably needing a big overhaul. Does that factor into, or does that mitigate the 8% savings?
Yes, it's factored in, but actually in P3 arrangements, the handback provisions, if you went through one of those contractual documents, the handback provisions are quite specific, and therefore when it's handed back, it has to be at a certain at a high level of maintenance. So they're not handing back assets that are ready to tumble into the ground. So that's part of the contractual provisions in the handback
like leasing
clauses.
a car, though, isn't it? I mean, in that period of time that you've leased the car, nothing goes wrong with the car in the first 100,000. But 4 years and 1 day when you hand it back to them, that's why the car's not worth very much anymore. It needs.
Well, I mean, you can sort of debate. I mean, it's not brand new, but there are absolute sort of provisions for handback provisions. So
you answered my question. I was wondering if that handback provisions were factored into your overall savings. It's your argument that even with the handback provisions,
I would argue that the governments are getting back better assets at 25 years at the end of their terms than they are normally if you take a look at government assets after 25 years. In fact, I think
it's been a very, very helpful overview, Mr. McBride. Thank you for helping us get off to a good start with our study on public-private partnerships.
Okay. If you through your study, please feel free to call it.
We may, in fact, invite you or someone from P3 Canada back as we proceed. Thank you very much. I believe the meeting is adjourned.
Thanksgiving to you all.